a whisper in the shadows, a dagger in the dark. For centuries, Florence knew one name that echoed with power, wealth, and ruthless genius: the Medici. They were bankers, yes, but their true currency was cunning. They ruled Florence for generations, not with crowns and scepters, but with wits sharper than any blade. Their enemies, from rival families to ambitious popes, often found themselves outmaneuvered, outspent, and outsmarted before they even knew the game had begun. Prepare to uncover the 10 most audacious moments when the Medici played their foes for fools, rewriting the rules of power with every brilliant calculated move. Number 1. Cosimo the Elder's return from exile. The year was 1433. Florence, a city of dazzling art and cutthroat politics, seethed with rivalries. The Albizzi family, old money and deeply entrenched, saw the rising power of the Medici as a threat to their very existence. Rinaldo degli Albizzi, a man of fierce ambition and an iron will, spearheaded a move to rid Florence of Cosimo de Medici, the shrewd and immensely wealthy head of the Medici Bank. They accused Cosimo of various offenses against the state, fabricated charges, and orchestrated his arrest. Cosimo found himself imprisoned in the Palazzo della Signoria, the very heart of Florentine government, facing a death sentence. The situation appeared grim. Cosimo's allies were hesitant, paralyzed by fear of the Albizzi. The Albizzi faction controlled the key positions in the Signoria, the ruling council. They held the legal power in the military force. Rinaldo degli Albizzi believed he had finally snared the elusive fox that was Cosimo. He wanted Cosimo executed, a public example made of the Medici challenge to their authority, but Cosimo was not a man to panic. From his cell, he maintained a composure that baffled his captors. He refused the food provided by his jailers, fearing poison. Instead, he relied on a loaf of bread and a small amount of wine smuggled in by a sympathetic guard, Federico Malavolti, who earned a significant bribe for his services. This act of caution, even in his desperate situation, showed his meticulous nature. While Rinaldo pushed for the death penalty, another powerful figure, Nicola da Uzzano, an older, more cautious member of the Albizzi faction, urged moderation. Uzzano knew that a public execution of a man as wealthy and influential as Cosimo could spark a civil war, tearing Florence apart. He suggested exile as a safer, less disruptive solution. This division within the Albizzi ranks was Cosimo's first sliver of hope, a crack in their seemingly impenetrable wall. Cosimo, through his network of contacts in the loyal Malavolti, was aware of this internal struggle. He did not beg for mercy, nor did he make dramatic pleas for justice. Instead, he quietly worked behind the scenes. He used his immense wealth to influence key members of the Signoria. He offered a significant sum, a massive payment of 10,000 florins, to the Gonfalonier of Justice, Bernardo Guadagni. This was not a direct bribe for his freedom, but a payment that effectively smoothed the path for a vote that would be favorable to his exile rather than his execution. Guadagni, already swayed by Uzzano's arguments for caution, found the personal financial incentive compelling. The money sealed his decision to advocate for banishment. The vote was taken. Cosimo was exiled to Padua for 10 years, a sentence that felt like a victory to the Albizzi, who believed they had neutralized their greatest rival. Cosimo accepted his banishment with a quiet dignity, but even as he departed, he began weaving the threads of his return. His exile was not a period of despair. Instead, it was a strategic withdrawal. Cosimo chose Padua as his initial destination, a city within the Venetian Republic, ensuring his safety from any further Florentine machinations. From Padua, he soon moved to Venice itself, a vibrant hub of trade and diplomacy. Here, he was not a disgraced exile, but a highly respected banker. The Medici bank branches across Europe continued to operate seamlessly, funneling profits and maintaining connections. Cosimo used his time to strengthen his alliances outside Florence. He formed close bonds with the Venetian government, extending loans and demonstrating his reliability. The Medici presence in Venice became even stronger. Meanwhile, back in Florence, the Albizzi struggled. They lacked Cosimo's subtle touch, his financial acumen, and his ability to manage the city's complex network of alliances and debts. Their rule became increasingly autocratic and unpopular. They alienated key allies, particularly among the wealthy merchant class, who had benefited from Cosimo's financial policies. The Albizzi tried to levy new taxes, further angering the populace and the guilds. Florence's economy began to falter without the steady hand of Medici finance. The shift in popular opinion was palpable. Many Florentines began to see Cosimo's banishment not as a victory for the state, but as a mistake, a move that had weakened Florence. His allies, who had remained mostly silent during his trial, now began to openly agitate for his return. They subtly spread discontent, highlighting the failures of the Albizzi regime compared to the prosperity under Cosimo's unofficial guidance. A year after Cosimo's exile, in September 1434, the annual elections for the Signoria were held. The system, involving drawing names from bags of eligible citizens, was designed to prevent any single faction from dominating. But Cosimo's allies had worked diligently, ensuring that a significant number of their supporters were placed in the electoral bags. When the names were drawn, a new Signoria with a clear pro-Medici majority was elected. The new Gonfalonier of Justice, Agnolo Acciaiuoli, was a staunch supporter of Cosimo. The very first act of this new Signoria was to issue a decree recalling Cosimo de Medici from exile. Rinaldo degli Albizzi and his remaining supporters, caught completely off guard by this swift and decisive shift, tried to resist. They attempted to raise an armed rebellion, rallying their remaining loyalists in the streets. But it was too late. The mood of the city had turned. The Florentine militia, largely sympathetic to the Medici, refused to obey the Albizzi. The people, tired of the Albizzi's heavy-handed rule, did not rise to their defense. Cosimo returned to Florence on October 5th, 1434, to a hero's welcome. The streets were filled with cheering crowds. It was not a triumphal military procession, but a popular acclamation, a testament to his quiet cultivation of loyalty and his indispensable role in the city's economic life. The Albizzi, realizing their power had crumbled, fled the city. Rinaldo degli Albizzi eventually died in exile, never to return. Cosimo did not execute his enemies. Instead, he orchestrated their exile, a softer punishment that solidified his image as a merciful, yet ultimately unchallengeable ruler. He dismantled the Albizzi faction by banishing their key leaders, seizing their properties, and breaking their financial networks. He then solidified his own power, not by holding official office constantly, but by controlling the electoral process, influencing appointments, and maintaining his immense financial leverage over the state and its citizens. His return was a masterpiece of political chess, a patient, calculated waiting game that saw his enemies defeat themselves through their own short-sightedness and lack of popular support. He had turned a forced exile into a popular mandate, ensuring that when he returned, it was not as a fugitive, but as the true undisputed master of Florence. Number 2. Ferdinando I de Medici acquires Livorno. The late 16th century saw Tuscany striving to become a dominant maritime power, but it lacked a truly great port. Pisa, once mighty, had seen its harbor silt up, rendering it less effective. Livorno, a small fishing village to the south, offered deep waters and a natural harbor, but it was undeveloped, barely more than a coastal settlement. Ferdinando I de Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, inherited this challenge. He envisioned Livorno as a bustling international hub, a free port where merchants from all nations could trade without the heavy taxes and restrictive rules that plagued other European ports. His ambition was to outmaneuver the long-established maritime powers of Genoa, Venice, and even Spain, drawing away their trade and making Tuscany an economic powerhouse. The obstacles were immense. Developing a port from scratch was an enormously expensive undertaking, requiring vast infrastructure, dredging, breakwaters, and warehouses. Attracting merchants and settlers to a barren, marshy coastline, historically prone to piracy and malaria, was an even greater challenge. Furthermore, the established maritime powers were not going to simply stand by and watch a new competitor rise. They had vested interests, powerful navies, and diplomatic influence. In Genoa, a fierce rival relied on its own port for its wealth. For Venice, mistress of the Adriatic, viewed any new Italian port with suspicion. Spain, a global empire with territories across Italy, including Naples and Milan, could easily stifle any Tuscan ambition. Ferdinando I, a former cardinal who had renounced his ecclesiastical career to rule, understood the long game. He did not launch a military campaign or try to force trade. Instead, he embarked on a cunning, multi-pronged strategy to attract commerce and people, effectively outmaneuvering his rivals through economic incentives and a vision of unprecedented freedom. His first move was a bold and revolutionary declaration known as the Leggi Livornine, or Livornine Laws, issued in 1593 and later expanded. These laws proclaimed Livorno a free port. Regardless of their origin or destination, could pass through Livorno without customs duties or significant taxes. This was a direct assault on the protectionist policies of other European ports. It offered an immediate, tangible benefit to merchants who sought to maximize their profits. But Ferdinando went even further. He understood that trade needed people, and people needed security and incentives. The Livornine Laws contained a groundbreaking clause that offered asylum and privileges to individuals fleeing persecution. This was aimed particularly at Jews, Protestants, and other religious minorities from Spain, Portugal, and the Ottoman Empire who faced harsh discrimination elsewhere. These communities, often highly skilled in trade, finance, and crafts, were offered full civil liberties, freedom of worship, and exemptions from certain taxes if they settled in Livorno. This was an astonishing proposition for the era, a time when religious intolerance was rampant. This policy was not just humanitarian, it was shrewd. Ferdinando recognized that these persecuted communities possessed valuable international networks, capital, and expertise. By offering them a safe haven, he was attracting a dedicated entrepreneurial population who would be deeply invested in Livorno's success. He was building a diverse, vibrant community from the ground up, populated by individuals whose skills were actively shunned by his rivals. Jewish merchants from Lisbon and Amsterdam brought their trading connections to the Levant and the Indies. Greek and Armenian traders brought their knowledge of Eastern markets. Protestant artisans from Northern Europe brought their crafts. This was a deliberate brain drain from his competitors and a cultural enrichment for Tuscany. Simultaneously, Ferdinando poured vast sums into Livorno's infrastructure. He commissioned the brilliant architect Bernardo Buontalenti to design a new, fortified city from scratch. He invested in dredging the harbor, building a new lighthouse, constructing impressive docks, and erecting a massive system of warehouses and fortifications. He even commissioned the Fossi Medici, a network of canals that connected Livorno to Pisa and Florence, facilitating inland transport. This was an enormous public works project, signaling his unwavering commitment to the port's future. The scale of the investment alone demonstrated that Livorno was not a temporary gamble, but a serious long-term endeavor. His rivals, meanwhile, could not match Livorno's unique combination of economic freedom and religious tolerance. Genoa and Venice were established powers, but they were also bound by tradition, powerful guilds, and more restrictive laws. They could not easily lower their taxes or offer such broad freedoms without upsetting their internal political structures and powerful entrenched interests. Spain, while powerful, was inherently intolerant, making it impossible for them to adopt Livorno's model for their own ports. They were stuck with their old ways, while Ferdinando was creating something entirely new. The initial years were challenging, but the incentives slowly began to work. Ships started diverting their routes to Livorno. Merchants, eager to save on duties, took the risk. The persecuted communities arrived in increasing numbers, drawn by the promise of peace and prosperity. They built synagogues, churches, and trading houses, transforming the desolate marsh into a bustling port city. Livorno became a magnet for international trade, especially for goods from the Ottoman Empire and North Africa, which often faced difficulties in more traditional European ports. Ferdinando also used diplomacy to protect his nascent port. He maintained good relations with various European powers, carefully navigating the complex political landscape. He understood that Livorno's success depended on maintaining neutrality and offering a safe haven for all, regardless of national or religious affiliation. He sent out agents and emissaries to spread the word about Livorno's opportunities, effectively marketing his new port across Europe. By the early 17th century, Livorno had exploded in population and prosperity. It had become one of the most important free ports in the Mediterranean, a testament to Ferdinando's foresight and his daring policies. The sheer volume of trade flowing through Livorno enriched the Medici coffers and elevated Tuscany's standing as a significant economic power. He had not fought a single battle against his rivals, but had simply offered a better, more attractive alternative. He outmaneuvered them by understanding the true drivers of commerce, and by being willing to embrace radical innovation, creating a city and a system that his traditional rivals could not or would not emulate. He built a port from nothing into a powerhouse, simply by being smarter, more welcoming, and more economically astute than anyone else. Number 3, Cosimo, the first de Medici's consolidation of power after Alessandro's assassination. In January 1537, Florence was in turmoil. Duke Alessandro de Medici, the first Duke of Florence, and a man often seen as a tyrant, was brutally assassinated by his cousin Lorenzino de Medici. The news sent shockwaves through the city and across Europe. For the Florentine exiles, known as the Fuoriusciti, a faction of anti-Medici aristocrats who had been biding their time in exile, this was their moment. They saw an opportunity to overthrow Medici rule once and for all and restore the old Florentine Republic. They gathered their forces, bolstered by support from powerful European figures like Cardinal Niccolo Ridolfi and other opponents of the Medici, and prepared to march on Florence. The situation for the Medici family was precarious. With Alessandro dead, there was no clear successor. The imperial forces allied with Alessandro were a factor, but they were also potential threats, as Emperor Charles V might use the instability to assert his own direct control over Florence. The Fuoriusciti believed they had the advantage of surprise, popular discontent, and external backing. Into this chaos stepped Cosimo de Medici, a young, untested man of just 17 years. He was a distant cousin of Alessandro, not in the direct line of succession. His youth and apparent lack of political experience were seen by many, including the Fuoriusciti and even some within the Medici inner circle, as a weakness. Filippo Strozzi, one of the wealthiest and most influential of the exiles, sneered at Cosimo as a boy without spirit or sense. This underestimation was precisely what Cosimo would leverage. Cosimo's first move was to appear compliant and harmless. He quickly traveled to Florence from his family estate, Mugello, presenting himself as a quiet, agreeable young man. The most influential man in Florence at that moment was Francesco Guicciardini, a seasoned diplomat and historian who, along with other leading Florentines, sought to secure a succession that would preserve Florentine independence while still satisfying the emperor. They believed they could control Cosimo, seeing him as a figurehead easy to manipulate. They proposed him as the new head of state, but with significant restrictions on his power, intending to rule through him. Cosimo feigned agreement, accepting their conditions with humble deference. This immediate acceptance disarmed his potential rivals within the city. However, even as he was being installed, Cosimo was already working to undermine their control. He moved swiftly to secure the loyalty of the city's key military figures. He focused on the few experienced commanders who had served Alessandro, ensuring their allegiance through promises and patronage. He made sure these commanders, not the old Florentine militias, were strategically placed to protect the city. He paid their troops on time, a detail that often swayed loyalty in an era of mercenary armies. The Fuoriusciti, led by Filippo Strozzi, were convinced they had the momentum. They assembled an army of around 4,000 men, a mix of exiled Florentines and mercenary soldiers, and marched towards Florence, expecting a popular uprising to greet them. They believed the city would open its gates and welcome them as liberators. They planned to sweep aside the young, inexperienced Cosimo and restore the Republic. Cosimo did not wait for them to reach the city walls. He understood that a siege would be politically damaging and give the exiles time to rally more support. He decided on a preemptive strike, a bold move for such a young ruler. He dispatched his small but loyal army, commanded by Alessandro Vitelli, to meet the Fuoriusciti outside the city. The two forces met at the Battle of Montemerlo on August 1st, 1537. The Fuoriusciti, confident in their numbers and their cause, were caught off guard by the speed and determination of Cosimo's forces. Vitelli, following Cosimo's instructions, executed a swift and decisive attack. The battle was a rout. The Fuoriusciti army was annihilated. Filippo Strozzi himself was captured along with many other prominent exiles. The aftermath of Montemerlo was where Cosimo's true cunning shone. He did not show mercy to the captured leaders. Instead, he systematically executed them. Strozzi, after a period of imprisonment and torture, either committed suicide or was murdered in his cell. This was a brutal but highly effective act of consolidation. It sent a clear message to anyone who dared to challenge his authority. Rebellion would be met with swift and lethal force. This ruthlessness, combined with his initial unassuming demeanor, stunned his Florentine advisors and external enemies alike. They had expected a weak boy. They found a hardened pragmatist. Cosimo also understood the importance of imperial support. He immediately sent envoys to Emperor Charles V, assuring him of his loyalty and demonstrating his ability to maintain order in Florence. Charles V, impressed by Cosimo's swift victory and his decisive actions, confirmed his title as Duke of Florence. This imperial recognition was crucial, legitimizing his rule and effectively nullifying any claims by the Fuoriusciti. Furthermore, Cosimo systematically dismantled the power of the old Florentine Republican institutions, which had for so long been controlled by the very people who had tried to control him. He created new councils like the Council of 48 and the Council of 200, filled with his own loyalists. He reformed the electoral system to ensure his continued control over appointments. He transformed the city guard into a loyal, professional force. He established a network of spies and informants to detect any lingering dissent. Cosimo I, barely out of his teenage years, had outmaneuvered not only the organized military threat of the Fuoriusciti, but also the subtle political manipulations of his own supposed mentors within Florence. He took advantage of being underestimated, acting decisively and ruthlessly when necessary. His victory at Montemerlo and his subsequent consolidation of power marked the true beginning of the Medici Duchy, transforming Florence from a fragile republic into a powerful, centralized state under his unchallenged rule. He had turned a moment of profound crisis into the foundation of a lasting dynasty, proving that even a young fox could be more dangerous than a pack of wolves. Number 4. Lorenzo the Magnificent and the Pazzi Conspiracy Aftermath. April 26, 1478, was a day of blood and terror in Florence. During High Mass at the Duomo, the magnificent cathedral, a conspiracy orchestrated by the rival Pazzi family, supported by Pope Sixtus IV and his nephew Girolamo Riario, exploded into violence. Their goal was to assassinate Lorenzo de Medici and his younger brother Giuliano, effectively decapitating the Medici family and overthrowing their unofficial rule of Florence. The plot was meticulously planned. As the host was elevated during the Mass, a signal for the assassins, Giuliano was stabbed repeatedly and died on the cathedral floor. Lorenzo, however, though wounded, managed to fight his way into the sacristy, where he barricaded himself until his loyalists arrived. The assassination attempt on Lorenzo failed. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The Pazzi conspirators, believing their plan had succeeded, tried to rally the Florentine populace, crying "Popolo, Libertà, people, liberty!" They expected the city to rise against the Medici. But the Florentines, instead of joining the rebellion, turned on the conspirators. They were loyal to Lorenzo and Giuliano, who had brought years of peace and prosperity. Inflamed by the sacrilege of the act committed in the Duomo, hunted down the assassins. Lorenzo, bleeding but alive, emerged to find his city in an uproar. His brother was dead, and a foreign power, the papacy, had dared to strike at the heart of Florence. This was not just a family feud, it was an act of war. The Pazzi family members, including the Archbishop of Pisa, who was complicit in the plot, were summarily apprehended and lynched by furious mobs from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria. Francesco de Pazzi was thrown from a window, his body paraded through the streets. As bodies of conspirators, including a priest, were hung from the palazzo, their faces staring out at the enraged populace. Pope Sixtus IV, outraged by the swift and brutal Florentine reprisal against his allies, especially the execution of an archbishop, immediately excommunicated Lorenzo and the entire Florentine government. He placed Florence under an interdict, a severe religious penalty that banned all church services, sacraments, and burials. Then he allied with King Ferdinand I of Naples, a formidable military power, and launched a full-scale invasion of Florentine territory. Florence, a city-state known for its diplomacy and finance, not its military might, found itself isolated and facing overwhelming odds. Venice and Milan, traditional allies, offered little practical help, fearing the Pope's wrath. Lorenzo's challenge was monumental. He had to defend Florence against a papal Neapolitan alliance, end the interdict, and restore Florence's international standing, all while grieving his brother and dealing with the internal trauma of the conspiracy. He could not rely on military strength alone. He had to outwit his enemies. His first move was to strengthen his internal position. The popular fury against the Pazzi consolidated his rule. He leveraged this outpouring of support, portraying himself as the savior of Florence, the victim of an unholy conspiracy. He systematically rounded up any remaining Pazzi supporters or sympathizers, seizing their assets and further eliminating any internal dissent. He presented himself as the protector of Florentine liberty against foreign aggression. Then, Lorenzo turned to the interdict. He defied the Pope's authority. He had the Florentine clergy declare the interdict null and void, arguing that it was based on an unjust accusation and a false premise. He ordered priests to continue performing services, risking their own excommunication. This was a bold move, effectively telling the Pope that Florence would not bend to his religious authority when it was used for political vengeance. This stance rallied the Florentine people even further behind him, showing their defiance against external coercion. But the military threat remained. The papal Neapolitan armies ravaged Florentine lands. Lorenzo knew Florence could not win a prolonged war against such powerful adversaries. He understood that the alliance against him was fragile, based on the Pope's personal vendetta and Ferdinand's opportunistic ambition. He needed to break it. Lorenzo embarked on his most audacious gamble. Without consulting the Florentine government, or even his closest advisors, he secretly decided to travel to Naples, directly into the lion's den, to negotiate with King Ferdinand I. Naples was an enemy territory, and Ferdinand was a cunning and ruthless ruler known for betraying allies and imprisoning rivals. It was an incredibly dangerous personal mission, risking his life to save his city. He arrived in Naples in December 1479 after a perilous sea voyage. His presence alone, a powerful ruler placing himself at the mercy of his enemy, was a psychological coup. It demonstrated his desperation, yes, but also his immense courage and his absolute commitment to Florence. For 2 months, Lorenzo engaged in intense secret negotiations with King Ferdinand. He did not appeal to pity or weakness. Instead, he appealed to Ferdinand's self-interest. He argued that the Pope was an unreliable ally driven by personal vendetta. He pointed out that Florence, if crippled, would no longer serve as a useful counterweight to Milan and Venice, potentially leading to an imbalance of power in Italy that could ultimately harm Naples. He also hinted at the vast financial resources of the Medici Bank, subtly suggesting future benefits for Naples if peace were achieved. He presented a vision of a stable, prosperous Italy where Naples and Florence could coexist peacefully. Lorenzo's personal charm and diplomatic skill were on full display. He won over Ferdinand's key advisors, and even Ferdinand himself. He cultivated an atmosphere of trust, despite the war raging between their states. He presented a clear, logical case for peace, making it more appealing than continued conflict. In February 1480, a peace treaty was signed between Florence and Naples. Ferdinand, convinced by Lorenzo's arguments, and perhaps wary of the Pope's unpredictable nature, withdrew his troops from Florentine territory. The Pope was left isolated and enraged. His alliance had shattered. Without Naples, his war against Florence became unsustainable. Lorenzo returned to Florence a hero, greeted by delirious crowds. He had stared down death, defied the Pope, and personally secured a peace that seemed impossible. The Pope, seeing his war efforts crumble, eventually lifted the interdict in December 1480, largely due to pressure from other European powers who feared the growing power of the Ottoman Empire and wanted a united Christian front. Lorenzo had not only survived the most dangerous threat to his family's power, but had emerged stronger, more popular, and with his diplomatic reputation cemented across Europe. He outsmarted the Pazzi through popular loyalty, outsmarted the Pope through defiance and clever diplomacy, and outsmarted Ferdinand through daring personal negotiation. He had turned a bloody conspiracy and a devastating war into a personal triumph, solidifying his nickname, the Magnificent. Number 5. Cosimo I de Medici's acquisition of Siena. Mid-16th century, Italy was a chessboard of shifting alliances and simmering conflicts. Florence, under Grand Duke Cosimo I de Medici, was a rising power, but still bordered by larger, more formidable states. One persistent irritant and strategic prize was the Republic of Siena, an ancient and proud city that had long been a rival of Florence. Siena was nominally under the protection of Spain, meaning the mighty Emperor Charles V. This made any direct conquest incredibly risky, potentially drawing Florence into a war with the most powerful empire in Europe. Cosimo I, however, coveted Siena. He understood its strategic importance, its wealth, and its symbolic value as Florence's ancient rival. Incorporating Siena into his burgeoning Tuscan duchy would consolidate his power, secure his borders, and elevate his standing among Italian rulers. The challenge was how to acquire it without provoking a devastating war with Spain, who considered Siena their protectorate. The opportunity arose from an internal conflict within Siena itself. The Sienese, known for their tumultuous politics, expelled their Spanish garrison in 1552, seeking to regain their full independence. This act of defiance angered Emperor Charles V. France, always eager to challenge Spain, quickly intervened, sending troops to support the Sienese rebels against Spain. This sparked the Sienese War, a major European conflict played out on Italian soil. Cosimo outwardly remained neutral. He sent polite messages to both sides, expressing concern for stability, but behind the scenes, he saw his chance. He knew that Charles V was a pragmatic ruler, stretched thin by wars across Europe. He also knew that Charles V was focused on consolidating his control over other Italian territories and suppressing the Protestant Reformation in Germany. Cosimo made a calculated gamble. He secretly offered to support Charles V, providing troops and funds to suppress the Sienese rebellion and expel the French. This was a risky move, as it meant openly aligning with Spain against a fellow Italian republic. However, he framed it as a necessary action to restore order and stability, a duty to the emperor. In exchange for his military assistance, Cosimo shrewdly negotiated a crucial condition that once Siena was subdued, its ultimate fate would be decided by the emperor, with Cosimo's interests strongly considered. He did not demand Siena outright, knowing that would be rejected. He offered to do Spain's dirty work, but for a price. The war was long and brutal. Cosimo poured vast sums into his army and personally directed the campaign. The Medici forces, under the command of Gian Giacomo Medius, brother of Pope Pius IV, laid siege to Siena. The city put up a desperate resistance, suffering terrible privations. The siege lasted for months, turning the surrounding countryside into a wasteland. Meanwhile, Cosimo used his diplomatic channels to ensure that other Italian states did not intervene against him. He emphasized that he was merely helping the emperor restore order, not engaging in a land grab. Finally, in April 1555, Siena surrendered. It was a victory for the imperial forces and thus for Cosimo. But the real game was only just beginning. Siena was now a Spanish possession, a prize of war. Cosimo had done the heavy lifting, but the city was not yet his. This is where Cosimo's genius for negotiation came into play. He did not simply demand Siena. He understood the complexities of the imperial court and the emperor's priorities. Charles V, weary of war and facing growing challenges elsewhere, was preparing to abdicate. He was more interested in stability and securing his legacy than in micromanaging Italian territories. Cosimo sent his most skilled diplomats to the imperial court. They argued tirelessly. They highlighted the immense cost of maintaining a Spanish garrison in Siena, a rebellious city far from Spain's main power centers. They pointed out that Cosimo, as a powerful and loyal ruler already based in Tuscany, was uniquely positioned to effectively govern Siena, ensure its submission, and absorb its administration efficiently. They emphasized that placing Siena under Florentine rule would create a unified and stable Grand Duchy, a reliable ally for Spain and Italy, rather than a constant source of trouble and expense. Furthermore, Cosimo offered to pay a hefty sum. This wasn't just a purchase, it was a compensation for the emperor's protection and a guarantee of future loyalty. The specifics were complex, involving payments over time and various concessions. He was, in essence, buying Spain's permission to annex a territory that he had already conquered for them. He even suggested that the money could be used to fund Charles V's ongoing wars, effectively turning Siena into a profitable asset for the emperor rather than a burden. The negotiations dragged on for years, continuing even after Charles V's abdication in 1556 and the succession of his son, Philip II of Spain. Philip II, just as pragmatic as his father, eventually recognized the logic of Cosimo's arguments. He was more interested in securing his vast American empire and defending Catholicism than in policing a rebellious Italian city-state. Finally, in July 1559, at the Treaty of Cateau-Cambresis, the comprehensive peace settlement, ending the Italian wars, Philip II officially ceded Siena to Cosimo I de Medici. It was not a simple gift. Cosimo had to pay a substantial indemnity, estimated to be around 2 million ducats, a massive sum. He also had to accept some Spanish garrisons and key fortresses within the former Sienese territory, the Presidio, which became part of Spain's Neapolitan territories. But these were minor concessions compared to the prize. Cosimo had achieved his goal. He had acquired Siena, not through outright military conquest against Spain, but by acting as Spain's proxy, then patiently and shrewdly negotiating its transfer, making it economically and politically advantageous for Spain to hand it over. He had outsmarted both the independent Sienese, who had defied him, and the great Spanish Empire by turning their strategic interests into his own gain. He gained a major city and consolidated his territorial control, elevating his status from Duke of Florence to Grand Duke of Tuscany, a title formally granted by the Pope in 1569, largely in recognition of his powerful unified state. His acquisition of Siena was a masterpiece of patient, calculated statecraft. Number 6, Piero Legudi and the Pitti Conspiracy. The year 1466 brought a fresh wave of unrest to Florence. Piero de Medici, son of the legendary Cosimo the Elder, had inherited the family's immense wealth and unofficial control of the Florentine state. However, Piero was plagued by severe gout, a debilitating illness that made him physically weak and often confined him to his bed. His ill health made many enemies believe he was also politically weak, an easy target. The most prominent of these enemies was Luca Pitti, a powerful and ambitious Florentine patrician. Pitti had risen through the ranks during Cosimo's time, benefiting from Medici patronage, but he now chafed under the family's dominance. He, along with other influential families like the Acciaioli, Neroni, and Soderini, formed a conspiracy to overthrow Piero and restore a more openly republican form of government, one they could control. They saw Piero as a soft, ailing ruler who could be easily pushed aside. The conspirators planned to assassinate Piero as he traveled from his country villa to Florence. They gathered armed men and set up an ambush along the route. Their plan relied on the element of surprise and Piero's perceived feebleness. They believed that once Piero was eliminated, the Medici family would collapse, and they could seize power. Piero, despite his illness, was far from naive. He had inherited his father's keen political instincts and maintained a network of informants. He was aware of the simmering discontent and the machinations of Pitti and his allies. He knew that his physical weakness was being interpreted as a sign of overall weakness, and he needed to demonstrate his strength without appearing tyrannical. One evening, as Piero was preparing to travel to Florence, a loyal friend, Giovanni di Neroni, secretly warned him of the ambush. Nerone, though part of the conspiracy, had a change of heart, or was perhaps playing a double game. He knew the precise location of the ambush and the conspirators' numbers. Piero did not panic. He listened carefully to the details. Instead of canceling his journey or calling for a massive escort, which might tip off the conspirators and lead to an open confrontation, he decided on a subtler, more audacious countermove. He feigned ignorance of the plot. He sent word to his villa staff to load his usual baggage onto a mule train, making it appear as if he would travel as normal. Then, at the last minute, Piero changed his plans. He rode at the head of his cavalcade, a larger, more formidable group of armed retainers than usual, but not so large as to arouse suspicion. He put his sickbed clothes and a few servants in the mule train, making it seem like a less important party. He knew the ambushers would target what they believed was the main Medici party. As the mule train approached the ambush site, the conspirators attacked. But to their shock, the party was not Piero's. The main Medici group, with Piero at its head, had already passed by, having taken a different route, or simply outpaced the slower mule train. The conspirators, realizing their mistake, were left confused and exposed. Their carefully laid plan had gone awry before they even saw their target. But Piero, having arrived safely in Florence, now had undeniable proof of the conspiracy and the identities of the plotters. He did not immediately arrest them. Instead, he took a calculated, patient approach. He summoned Luca Pitti and the other conspirators to his palace, ostensibly for a friendly meeting. They arrived uneasy and perhaps still bewildered by their failed ambush. At the meeting, Piero maintained a calm, benevolent demeanor. He did not accuse them directly. Instead, he expressed his concern for the divisions within Florence and called for unity. He spoke of the importance of peace and stability. He then casually mentioned that he was aware of rumors of discontent and certain gatherings. He gently made it clear that he knew their plans, but instead of retribution, he offered them a way out. Piero knew that Pitti was deeply in debt, having spent lavishly on his magnificent new palace and other ventures. He also knew that Pitti's standing relied on public perception and his ability to maintain his social and financial networks. Piero offered Pitti a lifeline. He hinted at financial assistance and continued patronage if Pitti would abandon the conspiracy and reaffirm his loyalty. He offered leniency, not punishment, to the other conspirators as well, but made it clear that their actions had been discovered. Luca Pitti, realizing that his plot had failed and that Piero was aware of everything, found himself in an impossible position. His associates were already panicking. Faced with exposure, potential financial ruin, and the prospect of Medici retribution, he chose to capitulate. He publicly apologized to Piero and disavowed the conspiracy. He and his allies swore loyalty to Piero. Piero, in a show of magnanimity, accepted their apologies. He did not execute them. Instead, he subtly dismantled their power. Pitti, his reputation damaged and his debts now controlled by the Medici, saw his influence wane. Many of his associates were gradually exiled or sidelined, their careers stifled. Piero did not need to use overt force. He simply exposed their treachery, stripped them of their leverage, and allowed their own weaknesses and internal divisions to unravel them. The Pitti conspiracy, meant to destroy the Medici, instead solidified Piero's control. He had proven that, despite his physical infirmity, his mind was sharp and his political hand firm. He had outsmarted his enemies by anticipating their moves, exploiting their weaknesses, and then disarming them not with a blade, but with a quiet, calculated show of strength and a strategic offer of leniency that ultimately led to their political demise. He turned their conspiracy into an opportunity to reinforce Medici power, ensuring his family's dominance for another generation. Number 7. Pope Leo X's election to the papacy. The year 1513 dawned with a power vacuum in the heart of the Catholic Church. Pope Julius II, the warrior pope, had died, leaving behind a Europe embroiled in conflict and a papacy in need of strong leadership. The College of Cardinals, the body responsible for electing the next pope, gathered in the Sistine Chapel for the conclave. Among them was Giovanni de Medici, son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Giovanni's position was challenging. He was a cardinal, but he was young compared to many of the seasoned cardinals. He was just 37 years old. He had been a cardinal since he was 13, but his family had been exiled from Florence for nearly 2 decades, only recently having returned with the help of Spanish armies. While the Medici were wealthy, their direct political power in Florence was still being re-established. There were many powerful contenders in the conclave, each with their own factions, national allegiances, and ambitions. The cardinals were divided into several major blocks: the old, experienced cardinals who favored traditional candidates, the younger cardinals, often aligned with various European powers, and the factions of particular families, like the Della Rovere, who wanted to maintain their influence. The conclave was known for its intense politicking, backroom deals, and often long stalemates. Giovanni de Medici, despite his youth, had a long history of political maneuvering. He had inherited his father Lorenzo's diplomatic skills and his family's pragmatic approach to power. He understood that a direct, aggressive push for the papacy would likely alienate too many. He needed to appear as a moderate, a compromise candidate, while subtly directing the flow of the election. His strategy was multifaceted. First, he downplayed his ambition. He did not grandstand or openly solicit votes. Instead, he presented himself as a genial, cultured, and relatively unthreatening figure. He was known for his love of art, music, and hunting, creating an image of a less austere and more approachable leader than some of the older, more rigid cardinals. This image of moderation helped him appeal to cardinals who might be wary of another warrior pope or a too dominant political figure. Second, he leveraged his family's immense wealth and extensive network. While actual bribery was technically forbidden, there were countless ways to influence cardinals. Lavish gifts, promises of lucrative appointments, and financial support for their families or projects were common tools. Giovanni made sure that Medici resources were subtly deployed to secure allegiances and build trust among wavering cardinals. He hosted lavish dinners before the conclave began, providing a comfortable and persuasive environment. Third, and perhaps most crucially, Giovanni understood the dynamics of deadlock. He observed the deep divisions among the leading candidates. Cardinals from the various European powers like France and Spain were often at odds, preventing any one candidate from securing the necessary 2/3 majority. The older cardinals were often too entrenched in their own rivalries. Giovanni allowed these factions to exhaust themselves. He let them bicker and battle, slowly whittling away at their support, while he remained a quiet, consistent alternative. He focused on building a coalition of younger cardinals, appealing to their desire for reform and a more dynamic papacy. He also made overtures to older cardinals who were tired of the protracted politicking and sought a quick resolution. He presented himself as the solution to the impasse, a man who could unite the disparate factions. His age, which initially seemed a disadvantage, became a strength. He was seen as someone who could offer a long, stable pontificate. Giovanni also suffered from an agonizing fistula, a painful medical condition. While this might seem like a weakness, he subtly used it to his advantage. His discomfort made him appear more human and vulnerable, perhaps less of a threat to those who feared an overbearing pope. He occasionally hinted at his frail health, leading some cardinals to believe he might not live long, making him a more palatable interim candidate. This was a clever misdirection, as he indeed lived for many more years contrary to their initial assessment. As the conclave dragged on, the cardinals became increasingly restless and frustrated. The food became monotonous, the air grew stale, and the arguments grew heated. Giovanni, known for his good humor and diplomatic touch, remained calm and composed. He was seen as the one who could bring an end to the discomfort. Finally, after 7 days of intense voting and negotiation, a crucial breakthrough occurred. The cardinals, exhausted by the deadlock, turned to Giovanni de Medici as the compromise candidate. He was not the first choice of any major faction, but he was the least objectionable to most. His moderate stance, his apparent lack of overwhelming ambition, his youth, and his ability to bridge divides made him the ideal candidate to break the stalemate. On March 11, 1513, Giovanni de Medici was elected pope. He chose the name Leo X. His election was a testament to his subtle political genius. He had outmaneuvered older, seemingly more powerful cardinals by patiently waiting for the right moment, by appearing to be less ambitious than he truly was, and by leveraging his family's resources and his own diplomatic charm. He had used his youth, and even his illness, as strategic advantages. His pontificate began with a grand procession and a promise of a new era of peace and prosperity. Leo X would go on to be a patron of the arts and a significant political player in Europe, but his rise to the papacy was a masterclass in subtle manipulation and strategic humility, proving that the Medici influence extended far beyond the walls of Florence, reaching the very pinnacle of European power. Number 8. Cosimo the Elder's financial manipulation of rival families. Cosimo de Medici, returning from exile in 1434, did not rule Florence with the brute force of a tyrant. His power was far more subtle, woven into the very fabric of the city's economic and political life. He understood that in a city-state built on trade and finance, control of money meant control of power. His greatest enemies were not just rival families like the Albizzi, but the very independence of other wealthy merchant houses that could challenge Medici dominance. Cosimo outsmarted them, not with daggers or armies, but with ledgers, loans, and the ingenious manipulation of public debt. Florence operated on a system of public loans called monti, which were essentially government bonds. Wealthy citizens were often compelled to lend money to the state, especially during times of war. These loans were often mandatory, but they were also a source of revenue and influence for those who controlled them. Cosimo, through the Medici Bank, became the de facto controller of Florence's public finances. He ensured that his allies and supporters were given preferential treatment, getting better returns on their loans or being exempted from burdensome levies. Conversely, he used the state's financial instruments to slowly but surely undermine his rivals. One of his most cunning tactics was the selective use of taxation and forced loans. When the state needed money, Cosimo ensured that his rivals, like the Strozzi or other prominent merchant families, were disproportionately targeted for forced loans or higher tax assessments. These were not direct Medici taxes, but state taxes, making it difficult for the victims to openly protest without appearing disloyal to Florence itself. These financial burdens slowly eroded their wealth, making it harder for them to compete with the Medici Bank or challenge the Medici's political influence. Furthermore, Cosimo was a master of using state debt to his advantage. Florence, perpetually at war or involved in expensive diplomatic endeavors, was often in debt. Cosimo and the Medici Bank were often the primary lenders to the Florentine government. This put the state, and by extension the rest of the Florentine elite, in a perpetual state of financial obligation to the Medici. If a rival family became too powerful, Cosimo could subtly influence the government to demand repayment of outstanding loans or to call in previous tax obligations, putting financial pressure on his opponents. He also used his control over the city's catasto, the public land and property registry, to his advantage. This system was used to assess taxes. Cosimo ensured that his enemy's wealth was accurately, and sometimes even slightly over-accurately, assessed, leading to higher tax bills. His own family's wealth, while immense, was often distributed across various accounts and branches, making it harder to fully assess or tax in Florence itself. Another brilliant maneuver was Cosimo's control over credit and interest rates. The Medici Bank was the largest and most influential bank in Europe. If a rival merchant family needed a loan for a major venture, or if they faced a financial crisis, they often had to turn to the Medici or banks influenced by them. Where Cosimo could then dictate terms, charge higher interest rates, or even refuse credit altogether, effectively strangling their economic growth or pushing them toward ruin. He could extend favorable credit to his allies, enabling them to prosper and further cementing their loyalty to him. For instance, when a rival family faced bankruptcy, Cosimo would not necessarily destroy them. Instead, he would often buy up their debts or acquire their properties at favorable prices, consolidating his own family's wealth and further diminishing the economic power of his rivals. This was a quiet, almost invisible takeover, done through the legal and financial channels of the day. The story of the Strozzi family is a prime example. Paolo Strozzi, a wealthy and influential rival of Cosimo's, found himself on the wrong side of Medici influence after Cosimo's return from exile. While Paolo himself was exiled, his family's wealth in Florence became vulnerable. Later, other Strozzi members, even if not directly exiled, found their economic opportunities curtailed. They found it harder to secure lucrative state contracts or to access credit. They were not violently overthrown, but slowly marginalized financially. And Cosimo's true genius lay in making his dominance seem natural and beneficial for Florence. He funded public works, supported artists, and contributed to charitable causes, creating an image of benevolence that masked his shrewd financial control. He made sure that the prosperity of Florence was linked to the prosperity of the Medici, making it difficult for anyone to openly challenge him without appearing to be undermining the city itself. He understood that power was not just about holding titles, but about controlling the flow of money and resources. By meticulously managing state finances, selectively applying taxes, controlling access to credit, and leveraging his bank's immense financial power, Cosimo de Medici systematically weakened his rivals, not with open conflict, but through a quiet, relentless economic squeeze. He bankrupted some, indebted others, and ensured that no other family could accumulate the kind of independent wealth that could truly challenge the Medici. This was a form of financial outsmarting that solidified his family's control for generations, laying the invisible foundations of their unparalleled political power. Number 9. Giovanni de Medici securing the Papal Bank. The early 15th century in Florence was a fiercely competitive landscape for bankers. Families like the Alberti, Peruzzi, and Bardi had dominated for generations, managing vast international operations. However, many of these older banking houses had faced recent setbacks, including defaults by powerful European monarchs and the general economic turmoil of the era. Into this challenging environment stepped Giovanni de Medici, the shrewd and cautious patriarch of the Medici family. He was building his family's bank from the ground up, aiming for something far greater than local success. The ultimate prize in European banking was the papal account. The Roman Catholic Church, with its vast network of dioceses, monasteries, and tithes stretching across the continent, collected enormous sums of money. The Pope's banker handled these revenues, managed his vast expenses, and facilitated transfers across Europe. This role offered not just immense profits, but also unparalleled access to information, diplomatic influence, and a reputation that could elevate a banking family to the highest echelons of European power. Other banking houses were fiercely vying for this lucrative, yet often risky, position. Giovanni de Medici understood that securing the papal account was not just about offering the best rates or being the richest. It required immense trust, discretion, reliability, and the ability to navigate the complex and often chaotic world of the papacy. Popes were frequently on the move, engaged in wars, or struggling with internal church politics. Managing their finances required a global network and unwavering loyalty. Giovanni's approach was methodical and patient. He observed the failures of previous papal bankers, who had often become entangled in the Pope's political ambitions or had overextended themselves with risky loans. He chose a different path. His first key move was to establish a reputation for absolute reliability and discretion. Giovanni ensured that the Medici Bank handled every transaction, no matter how small, with meticulous care and efficiency. Unlike some of his more flamboyant rivals, Giovanni was known for his quiet demeanor and his strict adherence to sound financial principles. He avoided ostentatious displays of wealth and focused on building a solid foundation of trust. Crucially, Giovanni understood the unique needs of the papacy. The Pope's funds needed to be collected from distant parts of Europe, transferred securely, and dispersed efficiently. Giovanni began establishing a network of Medici bank branches, not just in key trading cities like Venice, Bruges, and London, but specifically in locations important to papal finance, such as Rome itself, Avignon, the former seat of the papacy, and other administrative centers. This expansive and robust branch network was critical. It meant that papal funds could be managed locally, transferred quickly, and accessed wherever the Pope might be. Other banks might have branches, but few could match the Medici's network tailored to the papacy's itinerant nature. Giovanni also cultivated a personal relationship with the papacy. He was particularly successful in forging a close bond with Pope John XXIII, who was at the time one of three rival popes during the Great Western Schism. Though John XXIII was later deposed, Giovanni had shrewdly identified him as a powerful figure in need of solid financial backing. He provided him with loans and managed his finances, demonstrating the bank's indispensable service during a period of immense turmoil. This foundational relationship, even with a controversial pope, proved the Medici's capacity for loyalty and reliability under pressure. When the papacy was eventually unified under Pope Martin V, Giovanni seamlessly transitioned the Medici Bank to serve the new legitimate pope. He continued to offer reliable, efficient service. He extended loans to the papacy, which was often in need of funds for its various endeavors, but he did so judiciously. He made sure the loans were profitable for the bank, but also structured in a way that supported the papacy's immediate needs, making the Medici Bank an essential partner, not just a service provider. These loans were not just about money, they were about building leverage and demonstrating the bank's unwavering support. Giovanni also ensured that his bank was not overly reliant on the papal account, diversifying its investments. This meant that while the papal account was immensely profitable, the bank itself remained stable, further reassuring the papacy that the Medici were a secure and dependable partner, unlike some of their rivals who might be more volatile. The other banking families, some of whom had been papal bankers in the past, found themselves outmaneuvered. They lacked Giovanni's combination of caution, his extensive and strategic branch network, and his ability to cultivate a deep, personal trust with successive popes. They might have been wealthier or more established in their own regions, but they couldn't match the Medici's comprehensive, reliable, and discreet service specifically tailored to the church's needs. By 1420, the Medici Bank had firmly established itself as the primary bankers to the papacy. This was Giovanni de Medici's enduring legacy. It wasn't a dramatic battle or a grand political maneuver. It was a patient strategic acquisition of the most powerful financial client in Europe. This relationship became the bedrock of the Medici family's immense wealth, its international influence, and its eventual rise to political dominance in Florence. Giovanni had outsmarted his competitors not with grand gestures, but with quiet competence, unwavering reliability, and a keen understanding of who to serve and how to serve them best, securing a financial empire that would fund his family's artistic patronage and political ambitions for generations. Number 10. Cosimo the Elder's use of alliances and loans to control Florence. After his triumphant return from exile in 1434, Cosimo de Medici faced a unique challenge. He was the undisputed master of Florence, yet he held no official executive office. The Florentine Republic, with its complex system of councils and elected officials, was theoretically still in place. Cosimo understood that ruling directly like a tyrant would provoke widespread opposition and invite foreign intervention. His enemies, both within Florence and outside, were numerous and eager to see him stumble. He needed a way to control Florence from the shadows, to outsmart anyone who might challenge his authority without ever appearing to wield absolute power. Cosimo's genius lay in his mastery of the city's unofficial networks and its financial arteries. He operated through a system of carefully cultivated alliances and strategic loans, creating a web of dependency and loyalty that made him indispensable. His first key strategy was to control the electoral process without appearing to. The Florentine system used scrutiny, where lists of eligible citizens were compiled and their names were placed in bags, from which office holders were drawn by lot. Cosimo ensured that these lists were filled with his loyal supporters, known as the Amici degli Amici, friends of friends. He didn't overtly dictate the lists. Instead, he used his vast network of informers, his close relationships with key officials, and subtle pressure to ensure that only those sympathetic to the Medici were deemed eligible. If a hostile Signoria, the ruling council, was elected, Cosimo could simply ignore their decisions or use his financial leverage to make their rule impossible. If a Balia, an emergency committee with broad powers, was needed, he would ensure it was composed of his allies, who would then implement his policies. Simultaneously, Cosimo became the city's largest, most reliable, and often only source of credit. Florence was frequently engaged in expensive wars or undertaking vast public works projects. The state was often indebted. Cosimo, through the Medici Bank, was always ready to provide the necessary loans. These loans were not merely financial transactions, they were instruments of control. When the state owed Cosimo money, its leaders were naturally more inclined to support his policies. If a political rival emerged who needed funds for their own ventures, they often had to turn to the Medici Bank. Cosimo could then decide whether to grant the loan, what terms to impose, or subtly deny it, effectively stifling their financial and political ambitions. He could also call in loans at inconvenient times, putting financial pressure on individuals or families who were proving difficult. This put many Florentine citizens, from humble merchants to powerful patricians, in financial debt or obligation to Cosimo, creating a powerful incentive for loyalty. Beyond the state, Cosimo used his personal wealth to create a vast network of clients and supporters. He was an unparalleled patron of the arts, funding magnificent buildings, commissioning frescoes, and supporting artists like Donatello and Brunelleschi. While this earned him immense public adoration and a reputation for benevolence, it also ensured that many artists, architects, and craftsmen were financially dependent on him. He funded charitable institutions, providing relief to the poor and securing their goodwill. He offered dowries for poor girls, paid medical bills, and provided opportunities for young men to enter business or the church. These were not random acts of kindness, they were calculated investments in social capital, building a reservoir of loyalty across all classes of Florentine society. He also fostered key alliances with powerful families outside Florence, particularly the Sforza of Milan and the Orsini family in Rome. These diplomatic relationships provided Florence with crucial security and influence in the wider Italian political landscape. Cosimo cultivated these alliances through strategic marriages, financial support, and diplomatic favors. This meant that if any Florentine faction considered challenging him, they would not only face Cosimo's internal network, but also his powerful external allies. Cosimo's enemies, meanwhile, were caught in a trap. If they tried to challenge him politically, they faced a scenario filled with his appointees, a public debt to his bank, and a populace grateful for his patronage. If they tried to challenge him financially, they found their credit restricted, their businesses struggling against the Medici's vast network, and their wealth vulnerable to his strategic taxation. He rarely resorted to open confrontation. When rivals did emerge, he would subtly undermine their credit, isolate them politically, or orchestrate their exile through legal channels, often initiated by his allies in the government. The Albizzi, the main rivals he outmaneuvered to return to power, ultimately faced exile, not execution, which made Cosimo appear merciful while still eliminating his political threats. Cosimo's rule was a masterclass in soft power. He built a system where his family's prosperity was synonymous with Florence's prosperity, and where challenging him meant disrupting the very order and wealth of the city. He did not rule with decrees from a throne, but with whispers in council chambers, strategic lending, and the silent, irresistible force of a vast, grateful clientele. He outsmarted his enemies by making himself the indispensable foundation of Florence's power, wealth, and stability, creating a de facto monarchy hidden within the shell of a republic. His quiet financial and political manipulations cemented Medici rule for decades, long after his death.